Shalom, shalom, what a pleasure. What a joy to have you back with us for this free multi-platform Able Code course on the Mishnah. That oral tradition that was written down out of obligation, and as a last resort so as not to be lost in the distant 2nd century of the Common Era, and where the most original exegeses or keys to interpretation of the most famous book in history, the Bible, were codified. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you that we have now completed chapter 1 of the first volume or section of the Mishnah, this first section called Ziraim, seeds, and we have an introductory course that we offered free of charge in our previous class. The first tractate studied is Berakhot, or Blessings, and we have now finished chapter 1, which we are going to give a very quick review. In chapter 1 of Berakhot, there are 5 teachings or Mishnayot. The first Mishnaic teaching was a question about from when and until when the night Shema is read. The second Mishnah teaching was also a question about when and until when the morning Shema is read. As we have already seen, the Mishnah begins by analyzing the most important commandment, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The belief in one God, unique and indivisible, the most original and pure faith, the acceptance of the yoke of heaven on earth. This is the most important commandment of the law or Torah of Moses. This is even recognized by quotations from Jesus Yeshua and his disciples in the New Testament, which should much better be called the Mishnah of Yeshua, because a Mishnah is an oral teaching of the Tanaitic rabbis of that generation in the 1st and 2nd centuries. We then studied Mishnah 3, where for the first time the 2 most important schools of the Pharisaic world of their time confronted each other, the school of Shema versus the school of Hillel. Shema is more radical and literal, stating that the Shema should be recited either lying down or standing, as the text literally states. Keeping this literal commandment almost cost the innocent Rabbi Tarfon his life. Hillel, for his part, states that the Shema should be recited in any position, but with great faith and intentional kavanah. The biblical text of when lying down, when rising, and when walking on the road only reflects a specific time, a moment of the day. Ultimately, the halakha or rule was established by Hillel. Then, in Mishnah 4, we studied the prayers or blessings that must be added before and after the morning Shema, and the prayers that are also added to the night Shema. These are prayers of praise and thanksgiving to the Creator, and are prayers that seek to complement the recitation of the Shema. You can find all of these prayers in any modern-day siddur or Jewish prayer book. And the final Mishnah teaching in chapter 1 was that when reciting the Shema, a prayer is also added to remember the Exodus from Egypt, which is a code that allows you to free yourself from modern slavery or from the problems you may have in your life. And when communicating with God in the most important prayer, the Shema, it is good to ask that He, only He, send salvation into your life, just as He sent miracles to the prophet Moses in Egypt, and that He sent the Messiah for the final redemption, as the prophet Jeremiah foretold in the book that bears his name. So, from this first chapter on the Shema, we learn many things. The Shema is the most important prayer and commandment. It is the foundation of the monotheistic faith. This is even said by Jesus Yeshua himself in the Gospels. The Shema is also a protection against the forces of evil, especially in the dark or when things are not going well. The morning Shema is also counted as Torah study because you are reading verses from it. Being the core of the prayer, the Shema is accompanied by praise and prayers of love to the Creator, as well as remembrance and hope for spiritual and physical liberation, both important, of all oppressed beings. The Shema is the key to freedom. Now let's briefly explain the 2 rabbis mentioned in the previous Mishnah, chapter 1.5 of Berakhot. These rabbis were Elazar ben Azariah and Ben Zoma. Let's start with Elazar. What would you do if you were offered the position of leader of your country's Supreme Court at the age of 18? Would you accept, even though your beard was still growing? What if, magically, your hair turned gray to make you look wiser? This is a real and legendary case of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Yes, a teenager with gray hair who became Nasi of the Sanhedrin, the highest rabbinic authority of the 1st century. It sounds like fiction, but the Talmud tells it with all the seriousness in the world. Although, of course, also with its fair share of divine irony. Before continuing, We invite you to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with those seeking to understand the world from a different perspective. Thank you for being part of this community that doesn't settle for the superficial, the Codigo Abel community. With special thanks to the speaker, journalist Abel Flores. Elazar ben Azariah wasn't just young. He was about 70 years old, in his own words. A teenager trapped in the body, or at least in the hair, of an old man. But this aesthetic detail wasn't mere window dressing. It was a symbol of legitimacy in a society where old age equaled authority. And where, if you didn't have a white beard, you could hardly speak without someone ordering you to be quiet. And why did they appoint him? Because of a power struggle. Rabban Gamliel too had been deposed by his own colleagues. Too authoritarian, they said, and they needed someone with a wise face, but with an open spirit. Enter Elazar, with his radical humility and open-door policy in rabbinical study. A teenage reformer in the Sanhedrin? Sounds dangerous. Or liberating, because that was his legacy, to democratize knowledge, to open the academies, to tear down the walls of intellectual elitism, where previously only the enlightened or children of Kohanim priests, Levites, or children of wealthy families could enter to study in that very complicated first century in a Judea also invaded by the Roman Empire. But since Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah took power in that already battered and surviving Sanhedrin, dozens of voices of ordinary people studying could now be heard. The result? More diversity, more debate, more dissent. In an era where the Torah was more discussed than followed, Elazar allowed many versions to be heard. A kind of first-century rabbinic YouTube. And this was achieved by a young man or young adult of just 18 years old. And yet, when Rabban Gamliel asked to return, Elazar didn't make a fuss. He didn't mount a smear campaign. He didn't issue statements on social media. He agreed to share the leadership. A Nasi with power, willing to cede it. Miracle? No. Ethics. And perhaps a well-calculated dose of political intelligence. But if you think all this is pure edifying fiction, think again. The teachings of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah are far from motivational slogans. They are sharp, uncomfortable. They irritate the contemporary ego. He who has more wisdom than actions, his wisdom does not last. Translated into the 21st century, you can have all the titles in the world, but if you don't do anything useful with them, your intellect is smoke. A slap in the face to empty meritocracy, and a warning to those who make a living theorizing without getting their hands dirty. Another gem: if there is no Torah, there is no good behavior. And if there is no good behavior, there is no Torah. Harsh, isn't it? Because we love to divide. There are those who study and those who do. Those who believe, and those who live. But for Elazar, everything is connected.
Wisdom without ethics is arrogance, and ethics without content is cheap sentimentality. A lesson that comes in handy in times of emotional polarization and empty speeches 18 centuries later. Wow, this is still relevant. Ladies and gentlemen, this happens because technology has changed, even demographics due to the multiple mixes of ethnicities and human races.
But ethics and values, those have changed little. Do you want more Mishnaic teachings from Ben Azariah? But perhaps his most radical lesson, that of Elazar ben Azariah, was invisible, the act of relinquishing absolute leadership, of sharing power, of knowing that it's not about who rules the most, but about how to build a community where everyone counts. Something that is not as common as it should be in the Sanhedrin or in our parliaments. And even less so with so many authoritarian governments and dictatorships as we have today all over the world. Elazar ben Azariah is an uncomfortable character. He doesn't quite fit into the narratives of idealized sanctity, nor into modern leadership manuals. He is young, but wise. He is a leader, but humble. He is authoritarian, but democratic. Contradictions? No. Complexities. Like life itself. And that's the key. Because his figure is not that of a perfect hero, but rather that of someone who knew how to navigate the murky waters of power without getting lost in the reflection of his own ego. Someone who understood that teaching is not imposing, and that governing is not dominating. In times where wisdom is measured by followers, and authority is confused with shouting louder, Remembering a young man with gray hair who chose dialogue over monologue is not a historical exercise. It's a contemporary urgency, a teaching that will earn you, me, and us eternal life, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? In the Haggadah of Pesach, the Jewish Passover, he is credited with the teaching to remember the Exodus from Egypt all the days of your life, not just in happy moments, also at night, in failures, in the darkness. Because memory is not a museum exercise, but an antidote to moral amnesia. A reminder that freedom is not a state, but a constant struggle, even or especially when it's not noticeable. You have to understand something very important. The signs of the neshama, that soul that God breathed into man in the Garden of Eden, give signs of when it is activated, when it settles or blossoms, when it emerges from its hiding place inside the body. These signs are ethics and morality. The neshama, Kabbalah, spirituality are ethics and morality. Nothing more, nothing less. Don't look for magic or supernatural powers in the Bible. Seek to be ethical and moral 24 hours a day, as if God never stopped seeing you, because in fact, he never stopped seeing you. But perhaps his most radical lesson, that of Eleazar ben Azariah, was invisible, the act of relinquishing absolute leadership, of sharing power, of knowing that it's not about who rules the most, but about how to build a community where everyone counts. Something that is not as common as it should be in the Sanhedrin or in our parliaments. And even less so with so many authoritarian governments and dictatorships, as we have today all over the world. Eleazar ben Azariah is an uncomfortable character. He doesn't quite fit into the narratives of idealized sanctity, nor into modern leadership manuals. He is young, but wise. He is a leader, but humble. He is authoritarian, but democratic. Contradictions? No. Complexities. Like life itself. And that's the key. Because his figure is not that of a perfect hero, but rather that of someone who knew how to navigate the murky waters of power without getting lost in the reflection of his own ego. Someone who understood that teaching is not imposing, and that governing is not dominating. In times where wisdom is measured by followers, and authority is confused with shouting louder, remembering a young man with gray hair who chose dialogue over monologue is not a historical exercise. It's a contemporary urgency, a teaching that will earn you, me, and us eternal life, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? Now, let's begin today's class, the day we begin Chapter 2. Mishnah Berakhot 2.1 states, if someone was reading the Torah, the portions that make up the Shema, and the time came to recite it, if he directed his heart, with intention, he is exempt. He has fulfilled the mitzvah. If he didn't, he is not exempt. In the spaces between paragraphs, one may greet out of respect, kavod, and respond, aye, return the greeting. In the middle of a paragraph, one may respond, greet, out of fear, yaira, and return the greeting. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, in the middle of the paragraph, one may greet out of fear and respond out of respect. In the spaces between paragraphs, one may greet out of respect and return the greeting to anyone, without distinction. Now, let's try to explain what we're talking about here. Obviously, we're talking about two different cases. The first is about a person who is reading or studying the Torah, the portion or parasha of the Shema, and at that moment it's time for the reading of the night or morning Shema. Did this person fulfill the commandment or not? The second is about a person who is reciting the Shema, whether night or morning, and is interrupted, perhaps by someone who enters their room or wherever they are and greets them. Should they respond to the greeting or not? Let's go with the explanations and examples. Have you ever tried meditating while your cell phone rings, your dog barks, and someone asks if you've paid the gas bill? Welcome to the experience of reciting the Shema with interruptions. Because yes, even in one of the most sacred and personal acts of Judaism, the Mishnah had to regulate what to do if someone greets you in the middle of a spiritual connection. Yes, greetings. As if a good morning could jeopardize your connection with the divine. But before we get indignant, let's look at the context. Berakhot 2.1 isn't just about liturgical formalities. It's a mirror of something much deeper. The eternal tension between the sacred and the everyday, between absolute devotion and real life with all its mundane chaos. That is the earthly world we live in. Because you have to be very clear about something. In the Torah, in Judaism, in the Bible in general, the vine, your life, is in the city, in the community, in the cities, not in a monastery, not hidden, not far away. It's not like that. Quite the contrary. Holiness is achieved when one succeeds in exalting or converting the bad into good, the profane into sacred, the impure into pure. The Torah and its sages are against ostracism in any of its forms. What is ostracism? According to the dictionary definition, it refers to the exclusion or isolation of a person from a group, society, or activity, whether voluntary or forced. Although in ancient Greece, where the current term originates, ostracism was a form of temporary political exile decided by popular vote, where ceramic shards, ostracons, were used to vote. Currently, the term is used to describe social exclusion, rejection, or lack of recognition of a person by a group. In other words, the Torah is against living in isolation, being outside the community. It's not talking about something literal. It's talking about whether you live downtown, in the very center of the city, or whether you live in the outskirts or suburbs. You have to be part of that city, that community. That's what it's referring to. Before continuing, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with those who seek to understand the world from a different perspective. Thank you for being part of this community that doesn't settle for the superficial, the Codigo Abel community. With special thanks to the person speaking to you, journalist Abel Flores. And here comes the real drama, the interruptions. Because the Mishnah wades into the muddy terrain of social issues. Can you say hello to someone while reciting the Shema? What if that someone is your boss? Or your mother-in-law? Because life goes on, even if you're in the middle of the most fundamental prayer in the Bible. Rabbi Meir, true to form, allows for some interruptions. Of course, only if you're afraid. Literally afraid. If the person greeting you might hurt you if you don't respond, well, then yes, respond. Because the Shema doesn't protect against slaps. The Torah is sacred, but so is your nose or your job. Rabbi Yehuda, for his part, introduces an elegant nuance. He distinguishes between greeting and responding. Within a paragraph, one only responds out of respect. Between paragraphs, there's more room for courtesy. As if each fragment of the Shema had its own social traffic light, red, yellow, green. Everything is regulated. Everything is hierarchical. The Mishnah begins with an uncomfortable question. What if you were reading a random verse? Just because you like reading biblical texts at random, and it just happened that the time came to recite the Shema. Well, if you had the intention, if you were doing Kavanah, you're covered. You've done it. Mission accomplished. No blessings, no extra paperwork. This deed will be credited to you as righteousness, based on your merit, as long as you were conscious of fulfilling the mitzvah commandment. But what exactly is this Kavanah? A mystical concentration? A Zen-like focus? Or simply not thinking about what you're going to have for dinner while reciting? The Mishnah doesn't quite define it, but rabbinic tradition takes it seriously. Because saying sacred words without intention is like sending a voice message without hitting send. It sounded nice, but it didn't go anywhere. And of course, this isn't just an exercise in liturgical courtesy. It's an X-ray of the religious soul. Because what's at stake here isn't just whether you say hello or shalom during prayer. It's what weighs more, your commitment to the divine or your fear of what others will say, your sense of duty or your social common sense. At its core, what the Mishnah poses, with all its apparent legalistic rigidity, is a universal and existential question. How do we balance the sacred and the human? How do we maintain spiritual focus in a world that constantly demands multitasking? And if you think this only applies to devoutly religious people, think again. Today, our Kavanah disperses every time we open an app in the middle of a conversation. Every time we look at our watch while someone is telling us something important. Every time we interrupt the essential for the immediate. The underlying theme you need to address here is that even with the most important commandment and prayer in the entire Torah, the Shema, you must remain a civilized person, a brother, a father or mother, a son, a grandchild, a friend. Being a good person is as valuable as having your faith in God intact. In fact, The Gemara, which, as we know, along with the Mishnah, complements or conforms to the entire Talmud, says to be careful not to steal from a poor person. And the sages discuss this. What can you steal from a poor person if he has nothing? And they conclude that you can steal his greeting. The only thing you can steal from a poor person, today we'd be talking about a poor person, a homeless person, or a street beggar, the only thing you can steal is a greeting. But one of the commandments of the Decalogue is, thou shalt not steal. This is what we're talking about, living in community and society. The Mishnah, with all its legal logic, seems to understand this better than we do. That's why it distinguishes between respect and fear. That's why it regulates interruptions. Because it's not just about following rules. It's about prioritizing. About being clear about when you can pause and when you can't. When it's right to be silent and when courtesy can wait.
Perhaps the Mishnah isn't regulating greetings. It's teaching attention and intention. It's training us to know when the world can wait and when it can't. To understand that respect for others doesn't imply disconnecting from oneself. That honoring the sacred, whatever that means to you, your family, and your community, requires boundaries, and the courage to uphold them.
And as if this weren't enough, the Shulchan Aruch comes along centuries later, in the 16th century, in fact, and takes up these distinctions with surgical precision. It confirms that there are absolute exceptions. For example, in Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem Kivad, there is no interruption, not out of respect, not out of fear, not for anything. Because there are moments where the connection with the transcendent brooks no distractions. Period. Because they are also very short sentences, taking only a few seconds to complete. Doesn't that sound familiar? When you're having an important conversation and the phone rings. When you're about to put your child to bed and an email comes in. When you have the opportunity to be present and you waste it. Now, in this last part of the class, we need to delve into a very important concept for your faith, which is mentioned for the first time in the Mishnah, Kavanah, which is most often translated as intention. What does this Hebrew word mean? Imagine being told that the key to your spiritual life depends on a single word, Kavanah. Sounds mystical, right? But it's not magic, it's direction. Literally. Because in Hebrew, Kavanah comes from a root that means to point, to orient, to direct. Not toward the north, nor toward the nearest Wi-Fi, but toward something more transcendental, toward God. The problem is that many believe this is just thinking about what you're doing. No, it's more difficult. It's aligning your mind, your emotions, and your will with what is supposedly a pure act. Yes, that's what we sometimes do out of habit, but rabbinic tradition insists we should do it as if our lives depended on it. How difficult it is to break out of the routine. A lot. It's one of the problems of our modern world. Kavanah isn't a single thing. It's at least two levels of spiritual intensity. The first is kavanat halev, the intention of the heart. It sounds romantic, but it's actually brutal. It involves being aware that you're fulfilling a mitzvah or addressing God. It's not just moving your lips. It's understanding that, in that moment, you're standing before the creator of the universe, with all that that should entail, and that it rarely does because of the damned routine of our lives. The second level is kavanat hepe, or specific intention. Here, it's no longer enough to feel it in your heart. Here, you have to know what you're saying. Literally, word for word. In prayer, reciting by heart isn't the same as understanding the content and the message. It's the difference between repeating an advertising slogan or a siddur prayer daily, reading at a mile a minute, and reading a contract before signing it. And of course, this isn't just theoretical. Halakha Jewish law is exceedingly specific about Kavanah. For example, in the Mishnah and the Talmud, the Shema has a total concentration clause. The first verse is non-negotiable. Shema Yisrael requires your mind to be there, not on the grocery list. At this moment, just in that phrase, which you recite in little more than a couple of seconds, you can't even say hello.
In Rosh Hashanah 28a, in the Talmud, the sages discuss whether every mitzvah requires kavanah. Spoiler alert, most of the poskim, or later halakhic authorities, say it does. And the Shulchan Aruch, with its characteristic legal coldness, reminds you that before performing a mitzvah, you should think, I'm doing at least hem mitzvah, That is,
for the reason for the mitzvah, not because it's tradition or custom, not because your grandmother taught you, not because if I don't do it, what will they say? And this is where Kavanah ceases to be a religious technicality and becomes an uncomfortable mirror. Because how many things do we do every day without true intention? From listening to someone to signing a document, from making a promise to being present in a conversation while checking our cell phone. Kavanah is a call to inner honesty, to stop acting on automatic, to recognize that if you're going to say something sacred, you should at least understand what you're saying. And if you don't, well, maybe you're fulfilling the form, but not the substance. In the end, the question isn't whether you have Kavanah when you pray. It's whether you have Kavanah when you live. Because it's pointless to direct your heart toward God if, the rest of the time, you have it on autopilot. The great exegetes of Judaism have offered profound interpretations of Kavanah and its role in the spiritual life. Rashi, 11th century, France, commenting on Berakhot 13a, explains that Kavanah in the Shema means to fix the heart, Yecheven libo, toward accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, emphasizing that the first sentence should reflect on the oneness of God.
Maimonides Rambam, in Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Tefillah 4:15, states that without Kavanah, prayer is like a body without a soul. It requires putting aside extraneous thoughts and visualizing oneself as if in audience with a king. In Hilchot Kiryat Shema 2:1, 2, he emphasizes that the minimal Kavanah in the Shema is to understand the meaning of God is one.
Rabbi Shlomo ben Abraham the Rashba points out that Kavanah is a condition like a chila, ideally, in all mitzvot, but that in certain cases, if performed without it, the mitzvah may be valid b'diavad, after the fact. The Mary or Rabbi Menahem ben Shlomo on Berakhot 13a describes it as the focusing of the soul and warns that without it the act remains empty, even if the words are spoken mechanically. Arisal, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria gives it an esoteric meaning in Kabbalistic mysticism, directing the intention to repair spiritual worlds, tikkun olam, through combinations of divine names and specific meditations during prayer. Finally, the famous Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Israel Meir Kagan, in Mishnah Berakhot, Arach Chaim 101-1, warns that the modern generation suffers from praying mechanically, and that even a few seconds of authentic Kavanah are more valuable than reciting long prayers without attention.